So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, to colleagues and friends who are joining us for today's session on science communication featuring Alex Hutchinson. And again, many of you have not attended these before, so I will give a short little introduction to our series. I am Stephen Chung, and I'm from Brock University in Ontario in Canada. And our other co-organizers are Chris Tyler from Roehampton, near London or South London in the UK, and also Tadej Debevic from University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. So, whoops, let me go back. So we've been organizing these virtual environmental ergonomics symposia since the start of the lockdown in April 2020 was our first one, and we have been running them. The first season was on a weekly basis, and this one is now on a bi-weekly basis. All of the talks on various issues in environmental physiology, and we've covered almost every topic or every theme within the field of environmental physiology, from space to diving to high altitude, to heat, hydration, and also chronobiology, jet lag, and all of them are available in our website, which is icee2021.com/past events. And they also, most of them have student instructor guides for individuals to use in their teaching as they desire. So for example, in here on this one on pre-cooling and the use of menthol in the heat, we have different instructor guides from both speakers you see in the hyperlink there. So you're free to use them for your teaching or any other purposes that you wish. And in the spirit of science communication, I've also started another initiative also through icee2021.com, which is weekly Wednesday short science videos on different topics in environmental physiology. And the idea is really to get beyond just talking within the scientific community to really translate science to the broader public. So they're about 3-minute long videos on different topics, and you can see the variety that is up here. And besides being on the website, they're also available on YouTube through the Environmental Ergonomics channel. So feel free to check them out and share them with your family and friends. So without further ado, I'll introduce our speaker for today, who is Alex Hutchinson. Again, most of you know him through his writing for Outside Magazine and Globe and Mail. And before he moved to Outside Magazine with Runner's World. And of course, in 2017, he came out with this really fabulous book called Endure: Mind, Body, and the Curiously Elastic Limits of Human Performance. And it's a really great synopsis of a lot of the current thinking of why we fatigue during exercise, how much of it is physiology, how much of it is psychology, and the interplay between the two of them. And as you see in the byline here in his Twitter profile, Alex came from a physics background, but also a very elite endurance running or middle distance running background, and moved to this. And I'm trying to remember, Alex, when you and I first met. I think it was over a lot of calls as you were starting your journalism career in sports science, probably almost 10, 11 years ago, when you were in Australia and just getting going on this, where we had a lot of chats about exercise physiology and exercise science concepts. So, and over the years, I've just really appreciated Alex as a real strong advocate for quality writing, quality kind of science communication, and as a real advocate for our field. And I think I speak for most of the exercise physiologists in the audience and in the field that it's kind of a real badge of honor when Alex kind of profiles your work, because he's going to do a good job, and that he finds it really intriguing, and he has a really great ability to translate that interest that we have in the topic out into the real world. So today's talk is all going to be about science communication and Alex's kind of journey and his pathway and kind of how he looks at science and how we as scientists can also improve our science communication game. So just a single housekeeping note before we start, and that is if you wish to ask questions of Alex, we'll have a Q&A at the end that I'll moderate, but please use the Q&A tool that you will find on the in the toolbar to ask your questions, and then again I will moderate those at the end. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I will invite Alex to share your screen and give us your talk.
Okay, share. Are you seeing my title?
Yes, we are.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you for the very, very kind introduction, Stephen. And thanks also for the invitation to be here and be part of this very cool series. Stephen, you're right. I think it's probably 11 or 12 years ago that we first spoke. I called you, and it was actually in the very beginning stages of my research for Endure, which came out, I think, 8 or 9 years later. So that was a long journey, and I've written about Stephen's research a number of times, and he's one of many scientists who have given me their time or lent me their time and expertise. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of my perspectives and my experiences today, and hopefully, pay a little bit of that back. So my title here is what I wish scientists knew about science communication. And I should start by saying, okay, I read that and I see you could read that as a slightly obnoxious title. And I did see a few comments on Twitter expressing that sentiment. And I kind of had misgivings about the title, and I went with it. And there's an irony here, which is that one of the things I want to talk about today or one of the topics I'm going to discuss today is headlines, which are a very common source of friction between scientists and journalists. So think of the title as kind of a meta commentary on the content of the talk, that we're going to talk about some of these things like headlines. When Stephen asked me to talk about science communication, and it's a very big topic, and it can range from the sort of very big picture discussions of how we save the world from the idiots or whatever, how we save civilization, right down to very nitty gritty, like what should your sentences look like. What I wanted to avoid is just going through the usual sort of hand wringing about how we, educate the general public about the scientific process and things like that. I think probably everyone watching this, we all agree on this stuff. So I thought what might be more useful is for me to go through a little bit the sort of details of what my job is, how I make my living, what the forces and pressures are that shape what I do. In a sense, in the hopes that by understanding what those forces are, you'll maybe be a little less frustrated next time you're dealing with a journalist. But I guess so. I sort of divided the talk into three basic areas. First of all, just the really practical side of how I pay the rent, what I do on a day-to-day basis, what my actual job is. Second, on a more conceptual level, what do I see as my functions? And I put here, to filter, to simplify, and to entertain, with a question mark beside entertain for reasons I'll get into. And third, a sort of section on shaping your message. So not just for journalists, but for scientists, for anyone who's trying to communicate about science, what are some of the factors that we need to keep in mind in order to make that message accessible? So let's start with section one, how I pay the rent. So I'm a freelance journalist, and the important thing to understand about that is that I don't have a job. I don't have there is no paycheck that shows up in my bank account or in my mailbox every second Friday or whatever. I eat only what I kill. So everything I write, there's a cost benefit analysis of how much time it's going to take versus how much money I'm going to make for it in order to pay the rent. And these days, most of my work falls into one of these four categories: online writing, newspaper writing, magazine writing, or books. There are a lot of other categories that exist, especially these days. I do have an email newsletter that goes out roughly once a month, so I'm not really deep into that world. I'm one of the few people in the world who doesn't have a podcast, but I have appeared on a bunch of podcasts. Video is not something I've done a ton of, but actually I just dipped my toe in for the first time. There's a forthcoming documentary that I have a very small part in where I have an associate producer credit. Giving talks at various places, whether it's conferences or events. These are all ways that you can choose to spend your time, and all ways that sometimes, but not always, you can try and help pay the rent. For me, in terms of these four major categories, my current status is online. Is probably my main focus these days. I write a column called Sweat Science for Outside Magazine's website. It only appears on the website. I also have a column in the Globe and Mail, which is a newspaper in Canada that appears every second week, usually. In terms of print magazines, I do a little bit of writing for Outside's print edition, and I also have a column in a magazine called Canadian Running. And in terms of books, I've actually written 3 books, although the first 2 nobody actually bought or read. But Endure, most recently, it was in 2018. So in terms of how I spend my time, I would say those first 3 things, the online, the newspaper, and the magazine, my recurring commitments to those, my regular columns and things, they take about half of my time. In theory, the other half of my time then is free to take on bigger projects, to work on a book, or to be promoting a book, or to take on longer magazine feature assignments, or things like that. This is sort of a pre-pandemic estimate. During the pandemic, I'm spending a lot of time taking care of my kids. So that sort of 50% that it's for online newspaper and magazine, that's kind of all the time I have in some sense. So I haven't been doing a lot of bigger projects over the last year. There's a lot to say about the differences between these 4 different types of writing. The one point that I'll just emphasize is the time scale. The online world operates on a time scale of hours. Newspapers, they come out every day. Magazine, it's months. Books, it's years. As I said, I was doing formal interviews for Endure starting in about 2009, 2010, and the book came out in 2018. So that's a relatively slow process. I'm not the fastest writer in the world, but we're talking years. Even print magazines, when I'm discussing an article with or a pitch with my editor for a print magazine, we're usually looking 6 to 12 months into the future. So it's not, you can't write about what happened yesterday for a print magazine. Obviously, the timeline is faster for newspapers and especially for online. And that's going to be reflected in the interactions you have with journalists. If you're talking to someone who's writing for a print magazine, they're going to have more time to spend, and you're going to hear from them maybe multiple times. Online, it's like, bam, you're going to write something and it's done. And it's, the time they have to devote to it, the journalist has to devote to it, is much shorter. And this also, of course, is reflected on how much a journalist gets paid to do these articles. If it's something it's very ephemeral, it's going up, one day, it's here tomorrow and then gone the next. You get paid a lot less than if you're doing something for a print magazine or something more substantial. And that in turn dictates how much time you can afford to spend on it. So let me make that more concrete. As I said, sort of my Sweat Science column for Outside is a big focus these days. Now, here's what that looks like currently. This is the splash page for Outside, and this is the sort of the most recent 5 articles as of a couple of days ago. And you can see there's a sort of, within the theme of endurance science, there's an article there on sports psychology, one on sports medicine, one on environmental physiology, one on strength training, one on talent development or talent identification and development. So a pretty broad spectrum of articles. Each of these articles is based on, or is focused on, a new peer-reviewed study, or a relatively recent peer-reviewed study. Now, Sweat Science has actually been around for quite a while. I started it in 2009 it was a blog on WordPress that I just set up myself. I was writing about 4 or 5 times a week, and of course, there's no money in that. It was for free, and it served a few different purposes for me. One of them was trying to build an audience. Another was that it was sort of a sort of scratch pad or rough notebook. I was starting to write about exercise science, but I wasn't writing about all the studies that I came across. So this was a place where I could, if I saw a study and it was kind of interesting, but not something I could pitch to a newspaper or a magazine, I would just, make one interesting point about it, or take one interesting graph and say, hey, a new study just got published. This is an interesting graph. Check it out if you're interested. Now, in 2012, I then had the opportunity to move the Sweat Science blog from WordPress to Runner's World. And that was cool because I was now getting paid to do this thing that I've been doing for free. And officially, my contract called for 3 to 5 articles a week, which is a lot. 3 to 5 articles a week means in practice that I did exactly 3 a week. I was getting paid, depending on how you break it down, I was getting paid typically somewhere around, let's call it $80 to $100 an article. As this is not a side hustle, right? This is how I pay my rent. So $100 an article imposes some realities on the amount of time you can spend working on an article. Here in Toronto, if you're trying to make a living at $100 a pop, you have to read a lot of articles, and you cannot afford to spend a ton of time on that. In 2017, I moved over to Outside, and I was able to, the main thing I negotiated in that move was to write less frequently. Initially, I was writing 6 times a month, and now I'm writing 5 times a month. And that means I can spend a little bit more time on each article. But it's still like, realistically, if I spend more than a day on a Sweat Science article, I'm doing it at a sort of notional loss. And when I say a day, it's like, but by the time I write about an article, I've probably scanned 100 titles or whatever, and I've read 20 or 30 abstracts, and I've downloaded 4 or 5 papers to find out whether to find the one that I'm interested in writing about. And then once I decide on that, I'm reading the paper and I'm calling up a few other papers, things that it's cited, or other papers in the field to get some context. And then I'm writing. So in terms of the actual, once I've picked the paper, I have maybe half a day, notionally. Now, sometimes I spend a lot longer than that because studies are interesting or complicated. And it's just, I do that. But in terms of like managing a career, we're talking like half a day for an article. Now, there are some conventions, and some very good conventions in journalism, and in science journalism in particular. If you're writing about a study, you're going to call the author, you're going to call maybe a couple of the authors. You're also going to call a couple of scientists who are in the field but not associated with the study, to get independent commentary on that. I do basically none of that with Sweat Science, and that's not because I don't think it's a good idea. I think it's a great idea, but it's just not the reality that I'm living in this particular context, writing an online column. So for me, most of the studies, or most of my articles in Sweat Science, involve basically reading the paper, reading a couple other papers, and writing about it. So it sort of blurs the line between reporting on something and an opinion piece that's sort of commenting, here's what I think about this study. In a perfect world, I would devote more, and sometimes I'm able to make time to get in touch with the authors, and especially if I'm unsure about something, and exchange a few emails. But this is the sort of reality of the media world that I'm living in, for better or worse. Now, one other sort of comment in terms of getting things right. If you're wondering which, between online, newspaper, magazine, and books, where is the most reliable information? The answer is actually in consumer magazines, print magazines, because they're the one venue that has an independent fact-checking department. When I write for a print magazine, I will be working with an editor, and we'll complete the article. When I'm done, there's a completely separate department at that magazine called the fact-checking department, unaffiliated with my editor or with me, and I will send the final draft and all my research materials to that person, and their job is to independently verify all of it. So if you look at a fact-checking sheet, this is an example from the Atlantic. Their job is basically to go through and cross off every single word, including and, the, if, but, and all that, to show that they have independently verified every word. They'll recall everyone you interview or email them. And so if you're dealing with a magazine journalist, you may encounter this. You'll hear from someone completely different, a month later, or to verify what you said. That's not the case in, certainly not in newspapers or online. It's also not the case in books. Books, you're just relying on, some writers hire independent fact checkers, but basically you're just relying on the writer to get it right. Now, on this topic of fact checking, this is a clause from one of my article contracts, and it's a fairly standard clause, and it says the writer will not send a draft or any part thereof to a source or representative of a source before publication without consulting the publisher. This is a sort of broad journalistic principle. You don't share your draft or parts of your draft with sources. And there's good reasons for this. If you're writing about a controversial topic where there's multiple interpretations, it's problematic, and if it's problematic if you have one source vet it, and it's not, because it's not fair to the other perspective. And it's even more problematic if you try and have both sources vet it, because then you're going to have a conflict between these sort of two perspectives, and you're not going to have an agreement. So fundamentally, the journalist has to take responsibility for the interpretation of the information that he or she has collected. And this is, you can see why this is an important principle in, politics or business. It's also relevant in science when you're writing about controversial areas where there's differences of opinion. The journalist's job is not to be a mouthpiece for one perspective. It's to interpret multiple perspectives. That said, it gets you into trouble if you're writing about something that you don't understand, which is far more common in science journalism than it is in other types of journalism. So there's a sort of tacit agreement among science journalists that sometimes you have to ignore this clause in your contract, and you have to send passages or paragraphs to the scientists to say to check for factual correctness. I tell you this mainly just to understand that if you're hoping to sort of pre-screen an article that you've been interviewed for, and the journalist says no, that's not personal. That's the default assumption, and especially if that journalist has interviewed 10 people for that article, which is not uncommon. I mean, for a long magazine piece, you might interview 50 people. You can't send the article to everyone, or you're going to spend 6 months navigating all the sort of suggestions. But the one additional point I'll make about this, or the one confession I'll make, is that this is also sometimes a useful kind of excuse, because those of you who are as old as me may remember, not this particular recording device, but may remember that, the first time you heard your voice on a tape recorder. And your thought is like, man, what's wrong with this tape recorder? The microphone must be messed up, because that's not how I sound. Everyone else sounds the way they normally sound, but my voice sounds different. And then you sort of realize, oh no, maybe that's actually how I sound. And it's the same thing when you see yourself on video for the first time. You're like, what? Like, where did my hair go? Oh no, I can't believe it. And the same thing is true with written work. When you see yourself quoted, you always sound like an idiot. This is certainly true for me when I've been interviewed and I'm quoted. I'm like, I'm sure I didn't say that. And then if you play me the tape and it's like, oh, I did say that. It's like, well, that's not what I meant to say. Let me rephrase that and tell you what I meant to say. So this is like virtually 100% of the time, this is a problem if you then send like 3 paragraphs to a source to say, can you just check this for factual accuracy? All I want to know is if there are any factual errors in here. And what you get back is like 6 pages of minor suggestions on wording and how you could alter this. And the quotes are always changed. Because like, maybe I did say that, but I think it would be better if I phrased it like this. And what you find is the quotes, instead of sounding like a human talking to you, they now sound like the scientific paper that you're writing about. And it's like, no, the reason I called you is that I wanted you to speak to me like a human to explain it, instead of having a quote from your paper. And now the quote sounds like look, we're just lifting from your paper. So all of this is to say, I guess the takeaway is, if you see yourself quoted, you will be hypersensitive to how it sounds. It will sound funny to you. For the most part, it doesn't sound funny to other people. This is just normal. We are hypersensitive to how we sound. That doesn't mean you will never get misquoted or anything. That these things do happen, but for the most part, don't get stressed about if it's not how you would have written it. When other people are reading it, they understand that this is the journalist writing, and this is not how you would have written the article yourself. Okay, so that's the sort of brief section on the sort of nuts and bolts of what I'm doing and what forces I have to obey or respond to. On this more conceptual level, so my key functions, I think, filter the sort of fire hose of whatever thousands and thousands of studies that are coming out every week. No one's going to read all of them. And so certainly the layperson is not going to, the general public isn't going to read any of them. So I'm trying to pick out a few that will be of interest to that broader population. I'm trying to simplify it so they can understand them and understand the information if they don't have any prior background in that area. And I put entertain here with a question mark. And again, for reasons that I will come back to a little bit later or shortly. So filtering, again, let's go back and look again at this. These are the 5 most recent articles, at least as of a couple of days ago, for Sweat Science. Now, how am I picking those 5 articles? The first thing to ask is it news? This may strike you as a and by is it news, what we basically mean is there something new? If I call up my editor with an idea for a story, one of the first questions she will have is, so why are we writing about this now? What's new? What's fresh about it? And this may strike you as a bad way of deciding. Like in theory, we would all say, I would rather read about something that's interesting and important than about something that just happens to be what happened yesterday. In practice, people click on what's things that are new. And this is a broader point that I'll probably come back to a bunch here is in the internet era, publications know exactly who clicks on what and how long they spend on it. This was not true in the newspaper and magazine era where you could make assumptions about what people were reading. And so that can be very problematic if you end up trying to follow the clicks. But the truth is it also gives you some insights into what people will read. And the sense that something has just happened or that it's new is a very powerful motivator for people to click on it or to read it, to spend some of their precious attention. This doesn't mean that everything has to be seen as a breakthrough. And quite often I'll write about studies that maybe aren't that great or aren't that revolutionary, but that are about an interesting topic. And I'll use that study as the hook to say, well, this study doesn't end up actually telling us all that much, but it's about this topic which raises these really interesting questions. And here's what we know about this topic from other studies, and here's what we're still hoping to find out. And so the new study may only get a paragraph or 2 in my article, but there has to be some sort of hook there. And there are other types of news hooks too. It can be when the Olympics are coming up, all research about sports is suddenly topical. It doesn't have to be that the study's new. It just has to be there's something that answers the question, why am I writing about this now? Or for the reader, why would I read this now? What's fresh? Second thing, will it change my life? And this is another one of those filters that we might all wish was not relevant. Like there are tons of things that are fascinating that aren't going to help you run a faster marathon or live longer. And people are interested in what is the geology of Mars? Like it's interesting, but it's a harder sell than this will make you live longer. And so when a rover lands on Mars, everyone pays attention. But for the most part, the other 364 days of the year, it's very hard to pitch an article about the geology of Mars. And so if you look at these 5 articles here, 4 of them are telling you something that's like how to change your self-talk, how to deal with exercise in the cold, how to strength train on this miracle once a week plan, how to raise a kid who's going to win the Olympics so you can retire. One of them is lessons from the 100 most influential studies in sports medicine. That doesn't change anybody's life. And this article did prompt some conversation on Twitter among the sort of 50 scientists who read it, most of whom said this is a terrible list. But among the general public, this one kind of sunk like a rock. People are not that interested in it. It doesn't change anything for them. So there's if I'm thinking about what articles I could write about or trying to convince my editor, the ability to find some connection to people's life to say that this is relevant because you do X, Y, and Z, and you should be doing A, B, C instead. It's powerful, and you have to be aware of it. And it certainly influences, for better or worse, it influences my choices. Third thing is a high quality research. Now this, we could have a whole seminar on this, and this is a big topic of discussion, not just in science journalism, but in science itself. What sorts of studies are worthy of attention? And my intuition or my filters on this have evolved over the years. Like I have a much higher standard for, let's say, studies on supplements now than I used to. Even if it's a double-blind, placebo-controlled study, I've just seen too many studies about supplements that then never get replicated. Now I'm like, well, I don't want to write about this supplement until I see multiple studies from different independent research groups that confirm this, because I don't want to, I'm tired of writing about supplements and then looking back a year later and realizing, or 5 years later and realizing, oh, that didn't go anywhere. That was not a real result. So this is a tricky thing to get right. And it's not just about like sample size or, study design and things like that, although those certainly factor in. Among these 5 studies, one of these studies, the strength training study, that is a preprint from Sport Archive. And that's something I think a lot about, and I sort of am cautious about writing about preprints. I do it sometimes, but not often. And when I do it, it's usually from a research group that is well established, that I'm familiar with, and ideally that they're writing about something that is, they're presenting data as opposed to presenting some sort of a fringe theory. But that's certainly part of a bigger discussion about what's appropriate to talk about. And let me give a sort of practical example. I've written quite a bit about a technique called transcranial direct current stimulation. So a form of brain stimulation, electric brain stimulation, that may or may not enhance endurance performance. Now, it's unclear at this point whether this technique really works. And if it works, whether it's repeatable and reliable outside the laboratory. There's a lot of uncertainty about it, but it's a fascinating prospect from a scientific perspective. If you can alter the limits of endurance by changing how neurons talk to each other, I think that's a really important thing to think about. And from a practical perspective, it raises a whole bunch of ethical considerations and things like that. So I was writing an article on this in 2019, and I had an interesting conversation with a guy named James Wrightson, who's a researcher in this area. And he was really adamant that I shouldn't be writing about this topic, that scientists don't know whether this works. So the last thing we need is for everyone else in the general public to get this message about this miracle way of enhancing performance and going out and starting to zap their brains. And his take was look, writing about it in the lay press is a bad thing to do. And I think you were wrong to publish those articles so early. It's a hill I'm willing to die on. Now, I mean, I disagree with him. Otherwise, I wouldn't have written about it, obviously. But I understand what he's saying. It's a difficult thing to judge. What I would say is, in 2019, when I was writing this article, these were not preprints that I was writing about. There were at least 24 peer-reviewed articles on this topic out there. There were 3 meta-analyses which reached differing conclusions. So, do we know whether it works? Absolutely not. Is it a topic of active, ongoing scientific investigation? Absolutely. Is it interesting? Absolutely. And so thinking about the bigger picture of, trying to educate the public about the nature of the scientific process and why guidelines or advice sometimes changes as evidence changes. To me, I think a stronger way of doing that is not to try and pretend that, not to sort of refuse to discuss things with the general public until we have the sort of hypothetical day when we have a final answer, which may never arrive, as opposed to discussing the process, to talking about the controversy, to presenting the preliminary data, trying to put it in context, explaining that we still don't know the answer. And here are the shortcomings in this data, and here's the conflicting data, but talking about it. And, the last thing I'll say on this is like, if you do all that properly, you put it all in perfect context, you will still find that there will be some people who read that article and say, wow, I can become superhuman by, stimulating my brain. I'm going to do it. And you're like, no, that's not what I wrote. Didn't you read it? And so it's a difficult needle to thread, but I think you can't, to my mind, it's a mistake to just say we shouldn't talk about this at all because of the danger that some people will misinterpret it. Because otherwise, I think you end up with a different sort of trust problem where where people feel like, uncertainty is being swept under the carpet and not discussed at all. So anyway, that's the research quality part of filtering. If we go to simplification, I'm going to risk the wrath of scientists everywhere by quoting Malcolm Gladwell, who is a master simplifier, let's say. And here's a quote from him from a while back. You're of necessity simplifying. If you're in the business of translating ideas in the academic realm to a general audience, you have to simplify. If my books appear to a reader to be oversimplified, then you shouldn't read them. You're not the audience. Now, look, Gladwell is a lightning rod for criticism. And there's a lot of debates about whether he takes complicated ideas, boils them down into here's how it can change your life message, and misrepresents the results. And there's a very interesting debate and discussion to have about that. And I have this debate a lot with journalist friends. But I will say, one thing I absolutely agree with him is that it's absolutely inevitable that you have to simplify if you're talking. Otherwise, you would just give the journal paper or the PhD thesis you'd post that on the web and say, hey, general public, read this. But that's not going to happen. You have to be able to if you to simplify it in a way that people with no background can understand, maybe not the full complex details, but the gist of what's at stake in this research, that, not to put a point on it, but that oftentimes that they are funding. Now, let me give an example. Let me give a Gladwell example. In his book Outliers, he talked about something called the relative age effect, which probably most of you are familiar with. The data that he talked about, which is back from the 80s, looked at minor league hockey players from the Western Hockey League by birth months, and showed that 40% of them were born January to March, 10% were born in the last 3 months of the year. And this is in service of his point that very subtle and structural biases or effects can have long-reaching impact on the chances of someone being successful. And one of the criticisms of Gladwell's discussion of this is that it didn't include a fuller discussion of factors like this, which is, if you look, okay, what about, forget the Western Hockey League, what if you look at the true elite, the NHL? Well, look, these are Canadian-born NHL players. Look, the relative age effect more or less disappears. Once you get to the top of the top, the most talented and hardest working players get there, and it doesn't really matter when they're born. And so the question is, if Gladwell writes about this stuff, and he writes about it completely truthfully, everything is factually correct, but he omits this, is he misleading? Is that oversimplifying the picture? And I won't be able to resolve this debate now, because I think there are strong arguments on both sides. But one thing I would say is, like, Gladwell wasn't writing a manual on how to make it to the NHL. He was trying to make a broader point about how he wasn't writing about hockey at all. He was writing about the effect of subtle biasing factors that can influence your chance of success. So I think that relative age effect, regardless of whether it disappears by the NHL, is still a pretty important factor, that, the way you get streamed as a hockey player when you're 8 can influence your chances of being successful when you're 18. So, I mean, let me sort of make this a little more abstract. Oops, sorry about that. We're sort of trying to balance between too simple and not simple enough. And it's tempting to only focus on avoiding being too simple, to avoid being, because really what we're balancing between is being wrong, and no one wants to be wrong. But if you push too hard against being wrong, you end up being incomprehensible. So no one wants to have factual errors or overhype the information, or, like that relative age discussion, be incomplete. But if you say, well, I'm going to avoid all those errors, I'm going to make no mistakes, I'm actually going to summarize the results of all 403 studies that have investigated this question, then you end up with something that's too complex, that's full of jargon, that's too detailed, and basically is boring. And an important thing to remember is that, as adults now, nobody has to read our writing anymore. This is not grade school. And so, from the perspective of science communication, if you write the perfect article but nobody reads it, then you haven't communicated anything. Even if you've avoided all errors, if nobody reads it, that's not science communication. And that's actually my segue into the question of headlines. And let me just, I think I'm talking more slowly than expected, so let me make this quick and concrete. Here's a study I wrote about a few years ago from Mayo Clinic Proceedings, from a group at Queen's University. Separate effects of intensity and amount of exercise on inter-individual cardiorespiratory fitness response. Now, for those of you in the audience who are not familiar with this study, I challenge you to figure out what this study is about. It's about exercise. Exercise makes you fitter, and the more you do and the harder you do, the better, right? Like, I wouldn't click on that. Like, we know exercise makes you fitter. Why am I interested in this? Well, as it happens, I was at a conference where the lead author presented some of this data, and it's like, oh, that's really interesting. So I wrote about it for the Globe and Mail. And this was the headline: non-responders need to try harder when exercising, study suggests. And when I saw the headline, I cringed, right? Like, it's a little bit, sensationalist. But, and the usual response here is, I didn't write the headline, which I didn't. For the most part, in newspapers, at least, it's an editor who writes the headline. So I could say, not my fault. And if you look on Twitter, you'll find journalists whose entire Twitter bio is, I didn't write the headline, because this is a common thing. But the move to online has created a dilemma, because now I still don't have final say over my headlines, but I do suggest headlines for my Sweat Science articles. And once you're suggesting headlines, then you realize, oh, it's actually hard to write something that strikes that doesn't end up as separate effects of intensity and amount of blah, 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 that nobody reads, without running the risk of someone saying, hey, you're overhyping it, that's clickbait. And I've kind of, my opinion has moved on this, where I'm like, well, okay, let's look at the headline in this newspaper headline. Non-responders need to try harder when exercising, study suggests. That is what my article says. Now, I tried to say it in a very nuanced way with lots of caveats and yada, yada, but ultimately that is the basic idea. That's the reason I'm writing about the study. So what is wrong with saying that? And in fact, a couple of years later, Carsten Lundby's group published in this area, and their journal title was Refuting the Myth of Non-Response to Exercise Training. Non-responders do respond to higher dose of training. And again, in terms of serving the reader, these two headlines tell the reader what's at stake here. And it just for context, the debate here is that people respond differently to exercise, and there's lots of evidence that some people seem to not respond. But what these two studies are suggesting is that if you take the non-responders and make them work harder, either by doing more or harder exercise or both, then everyone responds eventually. And this is an important question, and it's an interesting scientific debate. And two of these headlines tell you what the debate is about. And one of them is a sort of exercise in ass covering, where no one can criticize this headline for being too sensationalist, but also no one's going to click on it if they don't already know. No one's going to read it if they don't already know what it's about, because it doesn't tell you what it's about. So that's my speech on headlines. I've now that I had to write my own, and again, you see very clearly that if the headline doesn't give you a reason to read it, no one reads it, and then what's the point of writing it? So to me, clickbait is a headline that promises something sensational and then doesn't deliver it. Here's how you're gonna. It promises you the 3 ways that are going to melt away body fat, but in fact, there's nothing like that. All there is a study that says that exercise is useful or whatever. This headline, non-responders need to try harder when exercising, tells you exactly what the study is about. Is that the full story? No. Are there caveats? Absolutely. The caveats do not fit in a 10-word headline. If you're interested in this topic, you click on the article and you read the article and you read the caveats. The headline is not the place for the caveats. It's to tell you what the central idea in this article is, in my opinion. Okay, last point on this sort of functions of a journalist. Are you supposed to entertain? In principle, my gut feeling is no. It's like, if I do those first 2 things right, filtering and simplifying, it's intrinsically interesting. If I've chosen the studies that are most interesting, and if I've made them comprehensible to someone who doesn't have a background in it, then this study is fascinating. I don't need to sing and dance and tell jokes or whatever to make it interesting. It's the material is interesting. But I've sort of, the counter argument to that is sort of summed up by this. This is a headline from Slate a couple of years ago. Scientists, stop thinking explaining science will fix things. And what the article is talking about is something called the deficit model of science communication, which is what I sort of intrinsically assume about how people learn, and how probably most of the people listening to this talk do, which is that if someone has a mistaken belief, then they're like that the sun goes around the earth, then you're like, okay, no, I'm going to tell you that it's actually the earth goes around the sun, and here's a bunch of evidence that will explain to you why we know the earth goes around the sun. And boom, problem solved. Now they have the correct information, and story over. The problem is that that's not actually how most people think. And in fact, there's something called the backfire effect, where if you present evidence that conflicts with someone's pre-existing belief, they don't say, oh, thank you for enlightening me. They double down, and they're actually, the strength of their belief in their initial pre-existing beliefs gets stronger. And this is a super problem, a big problem in the context of lots of issues in society today. And I don't have easy solutions to how to get around the backfire effect, but a couple of ideas that science communication theorists talk about. One is trust. You're more likely to get people to buy in or to listen to new information if they trust you. And so for those of you doing science communication, I would say one of the key predictors of trust is whether you're local. So if you are trying to communicate with within your institution or within your local community, you're much more likely to get buy-in because you're one of us, rather than some external voice coming and telling us that everything we believed is wrong. So that's a good place to start in terms of science communication is local. And the other thing is, people are more likely to be receptive to new information if you're appealing to their emotions. And the way you do that is with stories. So again, an example here. I think it was actually the last seminar in the series. Anthony Bain was one of the speakers who does some really cool research on apnea and freediving and things like that. So I wanted to write about his research a couple of years ago, and including, this study, peripheral chemoreflex inhibition with low dose dopamine, new insight into mechanisms of extreme apnea. That's a tough sell to an editor, right? Like they're like, yeah, I'm not sure our readers are really into peripheral chemoreflex inhibition. And so to write about that, what I had to do, I called up a guy named Brandon Hendrickson, who had recently set the North American record for breath holding. And I asked him to tell me about his breath hold. And I sort of painted that picture. Brandon Hendrickson, blah, blah, blah. There he is, submerged face down in the pool, emotionless under the dappled Grand Cayman sky, blah, blah, blah. And he's this dude who lives in Kansas and owns a tree care service, but he flies down to the Caribbean and holds his breath. I don't actually say a lot about Brandon Hendrickson. I have a paragraph at the beginning, and then I have a paragraph at the end. And in the middle, I have a whole bunch of physiology about peripheral chemoreflex inhibition and stuff like that. But to get people to be receptive to listening to that, you had to give them a story to latch onto. So, I will say, one of the conventions of journalism that I find sort of noxious is this idea that, let's say I'm writing about whether stretching enhances performance. I don't really want to call up, I don't want that sentence that, like, Joe Schmo, a 29-year-old firefighter from Nebraska, says he really enjoys stretching before workouts and he finds it really important. And yet the scientists say, like, I don't care what Joe Schmo thinks. So I do resist that. But at the same time, I now pay a lot more attention to trying to find ways of having some sort of story or narrative structure to embed the science into, just because it engages people much more effectively. Okay, so last section, shaping your message. This is again, not just from a journalistic perspective, but for scientists too. How do you get people to buy in by focusing on things like audience and story and language? First thing, I'll just make a distinction between science writing and scientific writing. Science writing is for non-scientists, and scientific writing is for other scientists. So we've been talking about newspapers, magazines, books. There's other types of science writing, for community engagement and so on. For scientists, scientific writing, you guys, this is the stuff on which your career is measured. It's stuff like journal articles, theses, and grant applications. The key point here, the reason I put this slide up, is that I think this distinction is crap. I think it's a very, very bad idea, that you can recognize when someone is putting on their scientific writing hat, and all of a sudden they're no longer thinking about the audience and who whether they're understanding what they're saying, and instead you're shifting into that mode of trying to demonstrate how much you know. And I think in reality, these are the same task. You're trying to communicate information, and to do that, you have to think very carefully about who you're trying to communicate with. And I think the fundamental error we all have to struggle against in any sort of communication is to think about the actual audience and not the people who pop to mind most easily. So when I'm writing, of course, I'm thinking about how my peers, how other journalists what they will think of this article, whether they will think that was a great analogy or a great metaphor or something. And I'm thinking about the scientists who I interviewed for it. Are they going to think that I did a good job of reporting their research? But that's like 50 people. And meanwhile, there's another 10,000 or 50,000 or something who might read it, who I don't know. And so I can't conjure up their reactions, but those are the people who in a sense matter more. And I think this is a classic mistake also for scientists. And the classic example is like the departmental seminar that you show up to, where there's a broad, diverse department with lots of different subspecialties. And the external speaker comes and gives a talk where 3 slides in, everybody but the person who invited the speaker is lost. And that's because the speaker was like, oh, this person invited me to give a talk. I need to impress. I need to show them how much I know. It's like, you're going to have dinner with that guy who invited you. So you can talk about it then. There's 99 other people in the room who have no clue why we should care about what you're talking about. And this is certainly, this is true for me too. And let me give one quick example. So a concept like running economy. Running economy is how much oxygen you consume while running at a given pace. Colloquially speaking, it tells you something about how efficiently you're running. But efficiency is not the same as economy. Efficiency is how much useful work you're doing as a fraction of how much energy you're expending. And so when I write about it, I'm always torn between, if I use the word efficiency, there's going to be 50 people who read this and think, God damn, doesn't this guy know the the difference between economy and efficiency. And I know that because some of them will write to me or send me a message saying, actually, it's efficiency, not economy, or economy, not efficiency. So I can explain it, but the problem is if I explain it, then I'm complexifying the article. And so I wrestle with this all the time, and it depends on in what context I'm talking about running economy. But I'll often say something like, running economy, a measure of efficiency that is analogous to the fuel economy of your car. And you might say, okay, well, problem solved. But there's a cost to that, and you're making that sort of decision with sometimes with every sentence, and certainly with every paragraph. Are you gonna serve the interests of the few, your peers who you want to impress? Or are you going to serve the interests of the audience? Because every time you add these digressions and the jargon, even if you define it, it's making it a little less accessible to someone who's trying to read it and comes to the subject without any background. So I guess the takeaway here, I think, is like, think of the actual audience, even if it means that the people in the office next door might be like, try and serve the people who are going to read it. And that applies to like grant applications, and certain scientific papers, as well as general communication. Story, I talked about this above, about why I've sort of become more sympathetic to the idea of telling a story. Telling a story doesn't necessarily mean, a man from Kansas who likes to go freediving. I mean, finding a story means having a beginning and a middle and an end, raising a question and then answering it, making a person interested in, well, what comes next. So in your research, it might be, well, what is the problem you were trying to solve? And, why are you able to tackle it now? What challenges did you encounter along the way? What was the conclusion? And that should relate back to the initial problem. It's amazing how often you read papers where it's like, here's the problem statement. You read the paper, you get to the end and like, I'm actually not sure. Did we answer the question? Is it yes, no? It's not clear. And what will happen in the sequel? You're creating tension. You're keeping people interested. And the key thing I would say is this first part, what problem are you trying to solve, is absolutely the most important. For me, it's the differentiating factor in as I'm scanning through papers trying to find something interesting. Some papers do an exceptional job in a very short time, in a couple of paragraphs, or 3 paragraphs, say, of setting the stage, trying to understand, here's what the background is, here's what we know, and here's why, here's what we're doing, here's the question we're trying to answer. Others, just everyone tries a little bit, but just leap over it a little too quickly, and I have no idea what the paper's about, and so I move on. Language, look, we all understand you're supposed to avoid jargon and keep sentences simple and stuff, so on. The one thing I want to say about this is read it out loud, like literally read it out loud, or at least under your breath. If you can't read the sentence comfortably in a manner, in the way that you would speak to someone next to you on the subway, then someone reading it is not going to have a good time either. It should literally be like a conversation. And I sometimes have helped scientists edit work, and sometimes I'll get to a section where I'm like, I can't edit this sentence because I literally don't know what you're trying to say. And so I'll say, so can you just tell me? Like, I don't understand what this sentence says. And they'll tell me. And it'll be like, oh, I just wanted to say that, if you get too hot, you're going to die. It's like, oh, well, that's perfect. Let's write that. And they're perfectly capable of explaining it, but they're in a different mode. They're in the speaking conversational mode versus the formal, I am a scientist telling you what I know mode. And so really, you should go through and simplify the language, the words, the sentence structure, the ideas, the flow, in a way that you would tell the story to a friend. So just, look, recap. These functions: filter, simplify, entertain. They don't just apply to journalists. I would say some of the Twitter accounts that I am most fond of do an excellent job of filtering. These are from scientists, people like Andy Jones and Trent Stallingworth. They're experts in the field, and they're using that to not just to talk about their own work, but to say, look, I read this study, that was great. I read that study, this is really interesting. Here's why this study is significant. So that function is super important. And then to craft your own message, you're thinking about the audience, the story, and the language. And the very last point I want to make is, it's all very well to talk about knowing the audience and meeting their needs, but what happens if you don't have an audience? Like, how do you find an audience? And I'm sure some of you saw this study that was published last, I guess in January. 1.1 million Twitter links to scholarly articles, and half got no clicks. An additional 22% got just 1 or 2. And this is a super challenge. And so one thing I would say about this is, be patient. It takes time. I think back to my sweat science blog, for 4 years, writing 4 or 5 times a week. It was a couple of years before anyone outside my immediate circle started reading those blog posts. And second of all, if you're doing it right, if you're doing it well, people will eventually find your work. And the example I'll finish with, I got this tweet a couple of weeks ago from someone I'd never heard of, saying, after your great column on self-talk interventions, so starting with flattery was her first good move. And then I thought you might be interested in work from a rising star at Aarhus University, Johanna, blah, blah, blah. I have no idea who this is, right? I click on the link, and this person is a PhD student in looking at cognition in Denmark. And I still don't know who this person. I don't even know how to pronounce her name. I assume it's Johanna. Apologies if anyone out there knows her, or is, I didn't know who she was. But she had written this really nice Twitter thread, 14 tweets explaining her new studies. And she had gone back and really explained, what is this study about? It's about how athletes talk to themselves when performing different sports. What are the factors, different intensity and skill levels? Then she's given some background. Here's what sports psychology knows. And then here's what the problem is. All the tests have been intervention studies. We don't really know about spontaneous self-talk. Here's the key result. Machine learning can distinguish between runners and badminton players, and runners, their key phrase is, what will I do later today? So I haven't had to go behind a paywall or click anything. Literally 2 minutes after I read this tweet, I was emailing my editor saying, hey, this is an interesting study. I should write about it. And the next day I wrote about it. And, there was an article from this, this woman who has a very small Twitter following. And at the time when I read the Twitter thread, I think there were only 3 or 4 likes of the tweet. It got a little more attention after the article came out. But the message is, if you're doing good work, it may take time, but people will find that work, and people will appreciate it. So I'm sorry I talked way longer than I intended to, but thank you very much for your attention. And for anyone who doesn't have to run, I am happy to do questions.
Wow, that was fabulous, Alex. And each slide, I think, gave all of us in the audience as scientists so much to think about, both from kind of to really kind of draw back the curtain of how journalists like yourselves work, rather than, and actually understand the nitty gritty, both the time pressures that you're dealing with, and also, again, your formula for filtering, for trying to, kind of get the message right, and all of those. So I think that just gave us really, really excellent insight into that. And the Q&A tool is definitely filling up. So I kept track of some of them as they were coming, and I'll start with a very simple mechanistic one, which actually 2 in the audience have asked. And where do you get all your papers? I mean, do you actually pay for them all, or do you have open access? How do you actually mechanistically get the papers?
Yeah, so this is top secret and strictly off the record, and no one will ever repeat
Okay.
this. My wife has academic access, so for the purpose of this conversation, she gets the papers for me, and this is a real issue, like, because it's, when I talk to other journalists, it's like, and this is a common, you can email authors and ask for it, but it's like, again, if I want to filter through 50 papers, it changes the game completely if I have to email 50 authors and ask for access. And some journals will, if you're an established journalist, will give you access to their archives, but it's like, there's a lot of journals out there, and you don't have access to all 30 of the journals. So yeah. So my wife is working on her PhD now, and I was strongly supportive of that, because I was like, yes, I need you to be in school for the rest of my career so that I can continue accessing papers.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a challenge, and I know, just like with institutions, that we don't necessarily always have access, and there are workarounds. So I guess another question that merges with what Amanda Farrell was asking, and also something I jotted down, is how do you kind of keep it fresh, right? I mean, in a sense, you have your regular online writing for outside, and it's somewhat formulaic in terms of like you've laid out to us. So how do you kind of keep it kind of fresh in terms of not just the science, which is obviously interesting, but the writing itself? And then kind of the second part of the question is, how do you balance again that, okay, I need to do this and I'll just get this done, versus really that exploring and investing in whether it's a new platform, again, whether it's podcast or kind of other opportunities. So can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, look, the honest answer is it's a challenge, and it's an increasing one. Because I didn't set out to be a sports science journalist. What I liked about journalism was the opportunity to be a generalist, to be writing about all sorts of different things. But a lot of factors have conspired to be, it's really been productive for me to have a specialty. But it's been like a little over 10 years now, let's say, that I've been doing this, and it's very hard for me to, it's like hydration is a great topic, but I've written probably 20, 30, 40 articles about hydration. And as a journalist, I can't just pick up where my last article left off. I have to go back to the start every time. I have to kind of loop people in. I can't just say, well, about all this previous debate that I've written about 10 times, so here's a new wrinkle. It's like, I have to go back to, water is something that is good for you. Some people drink, so I find that a real challenge. That was one of the motivators for me moving from Runner's World to Outside, to give me a broader palette. So Runner's World, I didn't have to write just about running, but it had to kind of relate to running. Outside, I'm able to write. I was able to add wilderness and environmental medicine as one of my journals. So I was able to write about, cold water immersion in whitewater activities and things like that. So that's one way, is to find new areas that I haven't written about before. But it's and that's a sort of ongoing thing where I'm trying to figure out how to broaden what I'm going to write about, because the simple fact is, when I started with Runner's World, I chatted with someone who worked there already, and to ask whether that was a good idea. And he said, look, it's a great place. It's got lots of interesting stuff. But the fact is, Runner's World's bread and butter for the print magazine is people who pick it up off the newsstand because they want to run a 5K, which means you always have to be having, every 12 to 18 months, you have a cycle. You have to have how to run your first 5K and how to run your first half marathon. And so the secret to happiness there, this guy said, who'd been there for 30 years, is like, you have to find ways of keeping it fun, even when you're writing about the same topic again. And it's not easy, and it doesn't always succeed. And the last thing I would say is, the sort of a key factor is having a mortgage to pay. It's like, it's good to remind myself that it's like, okay, I've written about hydration before, but you know what? This is a lot better than shoveling coal. Like, I have to pay my bills, and this is still fun, even if it's not as fresh as it was 10 years ago.
Cool. And Amanda also wants to finish by saying, thank you for your writing. Your book inspired me to go to grad school. So that's pretty cool. I'm sorry. But I'm also glad that you wrote about my hydration study in 2015 before you got
it was still
you
fresh.
got bored of it. And that actually kind of relates to another theme of questions, which is, do you ever get pitches from scientists on stories, and how do you deal with them? And both kind of, maybe that pitch isn't really interesting, but you still want to keep a good relation with them, and in case, because they do interesting stuff that may pay off down the line. How do you kind of deal with pitches?
That's a great question. I mean, first I will say, I get a lot of pitches from companies. I get, hundreds a week, maybe, of press releases that I can't even read them all, literally. And those are easy to dismiss, because they, anyone who's particularly persistent, I'm like, look, I really only write about peer-reviewed research. And they're like, oh, we have great research. It's like, okay, send it to me. And then I never hear from them again. But with scientists, I don't get a lot of, I get probably less than I would even like, because it's useful to know about new studies. I don't know, I can't keep track of everything that's happening. The trick is, going back to that filtering slide that I put up, there's a fairly specific set of parameters that's going to determine whether I can write about something that's also affected by like what I've written about recently. And often what I'll hear, probably the most often communication I get, or most frequent communication I get from scientists is, I've just written about a topic, and someone will let me know. It's like, hey, I appreciated you writing about that. By the way, here's another recent study on that topic that we did. And it's like, that's a cool study. And in many cases, I would have included that study in the article I just wrote yesterday if I'd known about it. And I'm sorry I didn't know about it, but I'm probably not going to come back to that topic for another year. By which time, even though I try to be organized, I will have forgotten. And so from my perspective, it's great to hear from scientists. And my hope is just that they understand that if I reply saying, hey, that's a cool study, thank you, and then I don't write about it next week, it's not because it's not a cool study. It's just that there's all these other wheels that are turning to make something. So I appreciate knowing about it. And there are definitely times when I'll be writing about a topic, and then because there's a new study, and I'll be, oh, wait, I heard from that guy like 8 months ago who had a study. I should look that up again. And then I'll add that in. So it's definitely useful as long as the other party understands that I appreciate knowing about it, but the filtering process is very specific in terms of what fits in the specific hole I've got coming up.
Yeah, I know. I recall when you and I were talking about my hydration study that came out in 2015. At that time, I was also telling you about this study that we were doing in the lab then about the motivational self-talk, and I remember you said, like, definitely keep me in mind when when that comes out. So
Yeah,
just
no,
to respond to Brady, there is that kind of continuing loop, so to speak.
yeah, it's not annoying to be sort of to get a heads up about some interesting research, because I am reading, an order of magnitude more papers than I'm writing about. And the hope is that it's creating a big iceberg so that then it becomes useful in the context of some future study, even if the hook, or if it's like, I just did this study 6 months ago, well, it's a little bit too old for it to pass the what's new filter. So it's tricky.
All right. And then we have a question kind of related to that from Brian Saunders. And I guess it really comes to the brass tacks of most of us in the audience are scientists or grad students getting into the field. Like, what should we kind of be doing in terms of, not just necessarily relying on media to disseminate our work, but ourselves? Like, how, like, should we be, again, like Johanna, doing Twitter threads? Should we be doing like videos like I've started doing? Like, or should we be writing a blog? Like, what are things that we can do above and beyond kind of waiting for journalists to say, hey, like, I'd love to write about your study?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think there's one answer, because I think one thing to understand, and I sort of alluded to this before when I was talking about my Runner's World or my Sweat Science blog. It's like at a certain point, there's a difference between a side hustle and trying to make a living at something. And if you're a scientist, job one is doing your science for the most part. And if you want to do science communication, it's possible to dabble in it on the side, but it's going to take time. It's going to, and so you have to be interested and motivated. And what you personally are interested in doing is going to be different for every scientist. So, it's like, Stephen, I'm going to guess that you enjoy the challenge of making the videos. That you're not purely thinking in terms of how will this help. You're also like, this is a fun challenge for me, an intellectual challenge to learn new tools. And I know that for me, journalistically, I've done similar things where I've learned like data analysis tools. I learned how to use R and stuff like that, and various things to make figures. That was not a good use of my time, because the magazine could have hired someone to do that. But it was like, sometimes you just do something because it's fun as well as useful. And so the various mediums that are available to people, like Twitter, blogs, videos, whatever the case may be, there's no like, you should do this, you have to do this. But it's more a question of finding a medium that is that doesn't feel, that you enjoy enough that it's not something you're going to abandon 2 weeks later. And I think Twitter is probably the lowest barrier to entry these days. I think blogs are kind of past. Podcasts are super hot these days, but they're so hot that it's a little bit hard to get attention. But they are, if you're someone who likes to sit to chat, there are a lot of people doing very interesting sort of niche targeted podcasts that get decent viewership. But I guess, yeah. So I'm not really answering the question, but I think it depends. And I think as a starting point, a place like Twitter, and then thinking not just of if all you want to do is promote your own work, and I don't mean that in a negative sense. Scientists view promotion as a great sin, obviously, but if all you want to do is share your own work, it can be very hard to get attention. So I think offering a good thing to keep in mind is offering a service that extends beyond sharing your own work, but using your expertise to help make accessible other work in the field. That's like, I remember when I was starting on Twitter, one of the advice that journalists was giving was like, 1 tweet for yourself, 3 for other people. Everyone gets sick of reading a Twitter feed if it's nothing but like, here's what I did lately, here's what I did lately, even though that is what my Twitter feed often looks like. But yeah, providing some value add is a good thing to think about, I think.
Yeah, and that's certainly one of the things I've tried to do with those videos. It's, it's not about my work. It's about really cool, interesting kind of work in the entire field of environmental physiology. So let's just take it another way. Okay, so apart from the blogs, apart from kind of promoting ourselves, our phone rings in our office or in our cell phone now, and it's a journalist or a media, not necessarily you. What should we as scientists be kind of preparing for? How should we, like, again, how can we work best with the media and while trying to get our message across without kind of, in a sense, what you've been talking about, getting it distorted, simplified, whatever? What should we be thinking?
So I think the first thing to understand is, or to try to hopefully get a sense of, is what is the outcome going to be? Is this like a quick 400-word hit that's going to run in tomorrow's paper about some news, or is this a 5,000-word feature or documentary that the reporter is going to take 6 months to report on? And those interactions are going to be different, and your expectations of what's going to happen need to be different too. So that's the first thing is to understand the big difference in those things. Beyond that, I mean, the other thing I would say is, I don't want this to come out wrong, but it's like, don't get too worked up about it. There is a chance you're going to be misquoted. Like, the only way you can guarantee not being misquoted is to refuse to talk to the journalist, and it's like, that's in my view, the frequency of these sort of terrible articles you see that get everything wrong, even though they may go viral among scientists, is much lower than the sort of the big middle of like okay articles that convey roughly what's going on, and maybe a few that really nail what's going on in the field. And you shouldn't let the fear of those occasional problems paralyze your interactions with journalists, because most of them are doing their best and are reasonable. But like, look, so after my book came out, I did a lot of interviews, and some of them I read, and it's like, man, you really did miss the point of everything I was trying to say in that book. It's not the end of the world. Like, it's and again, going back, so in other words, in a sense, what I'm saying is, don't over prepare. Don't start to overthink what you're trying to micromanage the message. They've got questions, answer their questions. If their questions seem to be missing the point, you can, say, hopefully, like, certainly what I try and ask in any interview is like, is there anything else I should be thinking about? Like, am I missing something here? And even if they don't ask that, you can insert and say, I think a really important point, like, it's fine. You should have clear what you think the message is. Maybe this is a good thing to say, is you should know what you want the headline to be, or maybe more generally, what the elevator pitch of your study is. And if you're not clear on what you want to get across, then there's a more chance that the journalist is going to be unclear. So if you know exactly what you want to get across, then, and I'm not suggesting you become a politician where no matter what question they ask, you just give your soundbite answer that is what you want. And like, be fair and try and answer the questions as best you can, but be conscious of what the message you want to get across is. Make sure you say it, and if they don't ask something that allows you to say it, make sure to say it again, and or to insert and say, you know, look, I really think that the most important thing here is X, not this other detail that you're fixating on.
Yeah, no, it's I'm sure all of us in science have had kind of that challenge of kind of maintaining our message without being kind of misquoted, and sometimes finding that we are misquoted, and it's a constant frustration. But I think the message is, I mean, don't let that kind of dissuade you from
Yeah.
really kind of
I,
promoting your work still,
I,
and maintaining true to your scientific kind of message.
I apologize on behalf of my journalistic peers who have screwed it up, but it's like, yeah, just go for a walk and then move on. Don't let that consume you.
Okay, and next question comes from Alex Williams, who is a young researcher, and she asked, for young scientists who are considering alternate careers to the kind of classic academia and interested in getting into SciComm as a career, like how would you recommend they start? Obviously, I listened to your podcast recently with Peter Attia. You went to journalism school, you did a ton of reading, you know, and you became a beat reporter with in Ottawa, you know, and that's how you kind of really learned the craft. Are there other ways, kind of, or what would be your advice?
There are lots of ways, and a couple of things I would say. First of all, think broadly about science communication. Like the number of jobs in science journalism is swiftly, shrinking fast and already very small. But there's a lot of science communication, within the context of universities and companies, and not just writing, but video, podcast. There's a lot of, or even within government, there's a lot of science communication within government. So think broadly if you're interested in translating messages to the public, and that'll widen your options. There's a sort of classic debate in journalism where it's like the old guard is always like, all these young kids with their fancy journalism degrees. Back in my day, we just, when I was 8 years old, I quit school and started delivering papers, and then they made me the editor in chief. It's like, yeah, that used to happen. It doesn't happen as much these days. So it's not that you need to know what journalism school teaches you, but the calculation I made is that journalism school was a credential that established that that journalism is one of those occupations where it's kind of like everyone is an expert in nutrition because everyone eats. Also, everyone knows how to write. And so there are a lot of people who like to do it as a sideline or as a hobby. And it's hard to distinguish between people who are serious about making a career about it. And so what I found is I was applying for a bunch of internships and didn't get them. And so for me, journalism school was as much about branding as anything, saying, look, I'm in, this is what I'm going to do. And so take me seriously. But you definitely don't need to do that. And if you're just sort of communications curious, I would look for opportunities. In the olden days, you'd say, well, why don't you volunteer for the student newspaper, get an opportunity writing that. These days, you don't even need to do that. You can start a blog, you can start a podcast, you can experiment and see if you actually enjoy it, because there are a lot of hobbies that become less fun when your rent depends on them. And that applies across the board. So I would try some things out. I would think broadly about science journalism. I would not feel duty bound to go to journalism school. There are science journalism programs available that focus specifically on science journalism, if that's what you're interested in. And the last thing I would say is, for me, having a science background was a real bludgeon that I could hit editors over the head with and say, look, you've got a bunch of poli-sci majors. I understand science. My physics degree has nothing to do with physiology, let alone with any other sort of science, but I know how to speak science. And so it can be an advantage. If you've got a science training and you want to go into communications, you do have a desired skill set.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess related to your interaction with your editors and kind of whether you follow the science or follow the audience, like how do you manage that conflict? Do you get kind of ideas from your editor saying, write about this because this is hot right now? And then how do you balance, being kind of just being on the bandwagon as opposed to really kind of guiding the news, so to speak, as opposed to, again, riding the bandwagon?
I've been pretty fortunate in that I've been able to have enough leverage. Leverage is, I guess, another way of saying I'm willing to walk away, is that to avoid having my stories dictated to me. anytime I've shifted editors, anytime either within a publication or changing publications or get a new editor, the new editor will tend to have lots of ideas. And I'll end up trying to explain that for what I do, at least in the sweat science context, I really don't like the approach of like, here's an interesting question that everyone has. What does the science say? Because the truth is, for most interesting questions, what the science says is, we're not really sure. And you're, there's no clear-cut answers, and the answer ends up being unsatisfying. And so what I prefer, the reason I'm always writing about recent peer-reviewed papers is that I far prefer to take a paper, find out what it says, and then I can say, here's an interesting question that we know the answer to, because I just read the answer. So I can frame the article about the specific question posed by that paper. The power dynamic can be different depending on the nature of the editor-journalist relationship. But yeah, I really try and avoid, and I just absolutely hate writing about a topic that's hot in the news such that there's 50 other articles. Like, I don't usually write about the most, even within sports science, it's like, I didn't do a lot of writing about stuff like ketones because it's like, well, everyone is writing about ketones. And there's only a little bit of evidence. So I don't need to be the fifth person who is reproducing what that one study says. So I'm looking for studies that other people haven't written about, even if they're not, those papers are less likely to go like super viral because I'm not in the pulse of what's hot. But that's the approach I've chosen to take. I'd rather write about something where we have new evidence and ideally not many other people are paying attention to it. But yeah, you can't always overrule your editor. So it depends on the nature of that relationship.
Yeah, and obviously the more clout you have, the more you can, as opposed to being brand new and this is what you're writing about. I don't care.
That's also, look, as a freelancer, that's also a crucial difference. And one of the things about being with the Ottawa as a newspaper reporter, I whether it's a personality defect or not, I hated being told what to write about, especially when I hated writing about car crashes. It's like, we can make an educated guess as to what the parents of this person who's just got killed in a car crash feels. Why do I need to go and knock on the door and ask them? I don't want to do that. And so that's why freelancing was particularly palatable to me. Because then if there's a story I don't want to write, you have to manage relationships with editors. So you may say, I'm just really busy right now, I can't do that story. You don't say, that's a terrible idea, I don't want to write that. But I have the freedom not to write about the stuff that I'm not particularly interested in.
Excellent. And speaking of kind of power balance and dynamics, is it a conscious or kind of choice in terms of, for you, when you not just reading a paper that's interesting, but also looking at the authors, whether it's kind of to have an international spread or to have a gender balance or anything like that, do you find yourself kind of hitting that dynamic of, I've written too many stories from, for example, this individual, or kind of?
It's absolutely a struggle and a problem, and one that I would say I need to do better at. Because look, once I've interacted with somebody in the past and they've been helpful, and then it's like, oh, I know that if I email this person, they're going to email me back. They're a known quantity in terms of research, and so that creates a bit of a feedback loop where I keep returning to research from the same people. And that, it's like 2 or 3 years ago, right around 2018, it was like, I realized, there was a lot of discussion about representation. I was like, man, I don't write about a lot of research about from female scientists. And that was when Endure came out. Someone pointed that out, and I looked through and I was like, wow. I mean, I've got Louise Burke and I've got Shauna Halson, but I don't have a lot of others. And it's easy to get defensive about that and say, well, look, the research is what the research is, and I this is what I write about. But that was a sort of a wake-up call to me to be a little more proactive in seeking out voices that I wasn't familiar with. And that's an ongoing, I'm sure if we look back at my last 50 articles or whatever, there's going to be geographic imbalances and gender imbalances. Like the journals that I look at often tend to be North American based, and also there's a ton of work in Britain, and that's probably linguistic bias too. So there's a lot of things to be aware of. One just story I'll tell, and this is, I think, for researchers out there, this is something to bear in mind. I was writing an article for the Globe and Mail last year, and the senior author was someone who I'd interacted with a number of times, and it was very, very helpful. But I'd written about it a few times. The first author was his former PhD student who had now moved on and had just moved on to her first faculty position. And the study was based on her PhD work. And the senior author was the corresponding author. And normally, just in a sort of, if it was just no names whatsoever, I would have said, I'll just got in touch with the corresponding author. But I made a conscious decision to say, look, I'll instead of contacting the corresponding author, who's another senior white male, I'll contact this early career female faculty position, and I'll give her perspective. It's her PhD thesis, so she's perfectly qualified to tell me about it. And so I emailed her, and she said, sure, I'd love to talk about it. I'm CCing the two senior authors here so we can set up a time to have a video conference. And they were already CC'd. There was nothing I could do. So we had a video conference, and the two senior authors went first to give some context, told me everything I needed to know. And they were more experienced at dealing with the media. They spoke in not sound bites, but they spoke fluently and gave me good context. And then I asked a few questions of the first author, and she there wasn't much else to say. She answered a few things, and ultimately I didn't really get any useful quotes from her. So the article came out, and I mentioned her, but all the quotes were from the senior authors. And look, it's very dangerous to generalize, but I guess what I want to say is, be willing to talk about your research. We're all cautious of not wanting to seem self-promotional, not wanting to take credit that's not entirely ours, to make sure that, and so that was her impulse. She didn't want to take credit. She wanted to make sure that her advisors also got credit for the work, because they had initiated the work and so on. But if a journalist calls, speak to them, and more generally, be willing to talk about your work. You are as much of an expert as anybody else. If it was your PhD, for example, and so because that is broadly speaking, one of the differences is some people are certainly more willing to put themselves out there, and you can say, well, you shouldn't just write about the people who put themselves out there. But it's like, hey, I'm on a deadline. I'm doing my best to write. Like, I can't go on an investigative expedition to discover the person who doesn't want to be seen or heard from.
Yeah, no, it's definitely interesting, kind of that recognizing that balance, yet trying to do your job in a timely fashion. Yeah. So it's a constant battle. It's now kind of 90 minutes in, so to be cognizant of Alex's time, we're going to close the session. But again, Alex, I want to thank you for a really, really enlightening talk, both in terms of how you do your job and, like you say, what I wish scientists knew about science communication and how we can do it better, both to help ourselves and to help individuals like yourselves, because journalists and the media have a vastly important role to play in the entire endeavor of translating our science into the world. So again, thank you first for your work, and also thank you for your time. I just have a couple of quick closing slides. So again, I want to thank everyone for their attendance today, the really active participation, the fabulous questions, and the discussion that we had. Just want to let you know, for our regular viewers, our next talk is, as usual, in 2 weeks' time, same time on March 18th at 11 o'clock Eastern time. This one's going to be highly relevant to the pandemic, and it's really a new kind of problem that many healthcare workers are facing, having to wear additional protective gear. And so the talk will be about COVID-19, healthcare, and also the impact of additional heat strain, mainly from having to wear all of this additional protective gear. So we have Sarah Davy from Coventry University, and also Yannick de Kort from Radboud University in the Netherlands, who will be giving that talk. So we will have that talk and the registration up on the website in kind of later on today or within 24 hours of now. And we'll also have Alex's talk up on the site also within 24 hours. So again, as Alex has probably seen, we have a continuing wall of fame for our speakers. So we've now added Alex on there. So again, I want to thank Alex Hutchinson on behalf of the organizers, Chris Tyler and Tadej Debevich, and also for the entire audience. Thank you all very much and hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.